The boy was no heavier than a sack of oats. But dead weight hangs different in a man's arms, especially when the world is watching, and the dust has not yet settled. Eli McCrae carried him across the riverbank, one bootstep at a time, water bleeding through the leather of his boots and mud sucking greedily at the soles. The sun hung low, swollen and cruel, lighting the canyon walls with the color of dried blood. The boy did not stir. He had found him curled under a mesquite shrub, skin burnt near black and lips cracked like riverbed clay. His arms were as thin as fence wire, his hair matted with dirt and ash. The child hadn't spoken a word, not even when Eli offered the canteen. He had just stared, hollow-eyed, waiting perhaps for a bullet, or worse. Eli knew what they'd say. They'd seen the tracks, Apache. The raids last winter had turned every man in Tularosa mean with memory. Mothers still woke screaming. Fathers drank before the sun touched the rim of their hats. Feeding one of them, bringing one home, it would be spit on a grave. He should have left the boy, but he hadn't. The bunkhouse was quiet when Eli returned. Just the sound of wind wheezing through warped boards and a pot clinking in the hearth. He laid the child on his own bedroll, wrapped him in a clean wool blanket, and spooned broth into his mouth until the boy turned his face and fell into a dark sleep. Outside, the plains burned orange. Inside, Eli sat cross-legged beside the boy, his hands trembling as he cleaned blood from tiny blistered feet. His fingers were cracked from days of hard riding, raw from lasso rope and weather. Yet they moved with a tenderness he hadn't felt in years, not since his brother died screaming in the canyon pass. Not since his mother was buried in a pine box too small for a woman who had carried 4 sons. By morning, word had already slithered its way through town. They called him traitor. Old man Dorsey spit in the dirt when Eli rode past. Mrs. Calder turned her face at the post office, clutching her child to her chest like a lamb before slaughter. Even Reverend Bright, who baptized Eli at 8 years old and buried his daddy at 39, said nothing when they passed at the well. Just a hard stare, like a hammer waiting for a nail. But Eli said nothing. He rode back each evening with extra firewood, brought the boy a shirt, showed him how to hold a spoon, spoke to him soft, though the child still hadn't said a word. The boy watched him like a coyote watches a trap ready to bolt, unsure of kindness. Ellie didn't ask his name, didn't have to. Names had weight, but sometimes silence could hold more truth than any name. That third week, a hawk landed on the post outside the corral. The boy stood beside Eli, watching it with wide eyes. He reached out a hand, then drew it back. For the first time, he spoke not in English, but something older, something buried deep in the dry roots of this land. A single word. Eli didn't know what it meant, but it cracked something inside him open. He nodded, and the boy smiled, faint as dust. But not everyone smiled. Sheriff Daniels rode out that night, rifle across his saddle, and a face carved from stone. The knock on Eli's door wasn't loud, just final. "They say you're harboring an Apache," he said. Ellie didn't answer. "You know the law." "The boy's not a warrior," Eli said, his voice low, steady. "He's starving. He's 10, maybe less. That 10-year-old's people cut the tongues from half of Perkins' family. That boy's blood's Apache." Eli looked past the sheriff to the dying light. "Then let me teach him something different." Daniels didn't answer, just rode off. But trouble never rides alone. That Sunday, 3 men waited outside the church, pitch in their eyes. They didn't carry torches, but they might as well have. When Eli rode into town to buy medicine for the boy's fever, the first bottle shattered against his shoulder. "Feeding a snake don't make it a dog," one of them muttered. Eli stood his ground, let the rest of the bottles hit, never raised a hand. Only when they were gone did he kneel to pick up the glass, hands bleeding, jaw clenched. Behind him, someone helped gather the pieces. Miss Cora Bennett, a widow, quiet, fierce in her own way. She looked him dead in the eye. "I saw what he looked like when you brought him in. That wasn't a warrior. That was a child." Eli didn't say anything. She placed the bottle in his hand. "Keep doing what you're doing." Then she turned and walked away. He watched her go. Something shifted in his chest. Not all things, it seemed, were lost. Winter had not yet come, but the wind already carried the bite of it. Sharp, clean, like a blade slid across the skin just to remind you it was there. The boy who now answered to the name Eli had given him, Isaac was up before dawn most mornings, shadowing Eli like a fawn to a buck. He did not speak much, but his eyes watched everything. His silence was not empty now, but careful, like he was studying the world for a second chance. Eli taught him the rhythm of the land, how to patch a fence with bent nails and willpower, how to judge the weight of a sky before it turned to storm, how to feel the ground for snakes and the cattle for sickness. Isaac learned quick, too quick. It made Eli ache, watching the boy's eyes grow older without permission. In the evenings, Cora would stop by with bread or salve, claiming some errand or excuse. Sometimes she stayed, sitting on the porch while Isaac listened to the wind, his small hands tracing shapes in the dirt. Once, Eli caught her watching the boy sleep, her face soft, unreadable. She had lost a child. Everyone knew. A fever had taken him one spring, along with half the Bennett orchard. Her husband followed the next winter, some said by his own hand. Eli didn't ask. Grief was not something you prodded with questions. One evening, Cora brought a small wooden flute, said it had belonged to her boy. She placed it in Isaac's hands without a word. He looked at her, then at Eli, then at the flute. Then, slowly, he lifted it to his lips. It took time, weeks, before the first clear note sang through the dusk. But when it did, Eli turned his head toward the sound and felt, for the first time in years, something move in his throat like prayer. Then came the letters, typed, cold, signed by some judge in Santa Fe. Words like custody and removal and danger to community. Someone had sent word. Maybe Reverend Bright, maybe Sheriff Daniels. Someone wanted the boy gone to a reservation camp down south, where children were stripped clean of names and silence was no longer a choice but an order. Eli stared at the paper in the flickering lamplight, fists clenched on the table. "They'll kill him there," he muttered. Cora stood across from him, quiet. "Then, we won't let them." It was the first time she had said, "we." That night, Eli packed a saddlebag with jerky, water, the deed to the ranch, and the flute, just in case. He would not let them take the boy. Not again. But Isaac heard the whispered plans. He stood in the doorway, feet bare on the wood floor, arms crossed over his chest. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Isaac walked forward, pulled the paper from Eli's hands, and tore it neatly in two. "I stay," he said, voice small but firm. It was the first time he had spoken English. Eli sat down hard in the chair. Cora covered her mouth, and Isaac walked out onto the porch, standing straight as any man. Words spread fast after that. Some said Eli was starting a school for Apache orphans. Others said he was raising an army. One man claimed he'd seen Isaac with a knife, sneaking through the cattle pens. They came at night. 4 men, faces hidden, flames in hunt. Eli met them at the gate, rifle in the crook of his arm. "You think you can save him?" one growled. "I think he already saved himself," Eli said, and stepped forward. The standoff didn't last long. Cora had called the sheriff before the men even lit their torches. Daniels arrived on horseback with a shotgun, and for the first time in his life, Eli was glad to see the law ride in. The men scattered like rats in sunlight. One left his torch behind, still smoking in the dirt. The sheriff looked at Eli, then at Isaac, who stood behind him, eyes steady. "You sure about this?" he asked. Eli nodded once. "He's mine." Sheriff Daniels grunted, then tipped his hat and rode away. By spring, the whispers faded. The earth had a way of swallowing noise, and the land, hard and harsh and holy, kept on growing. Isaac spoke more often now, English mixed with Apache, his own songs humming through the fields. He carved shapes into wood with his pocket knife, little animals and stories. Eli kept them on the mantel. One evening, after the branding was done and the cattle fed, Isaac handed Eli a carved horse. "For you," he said. Eli took it, his fingers brushing the smooth wood. His throat ached. "Thank you, son." Cora stood in the doorway, arms crossed, smile low and real. A family, that's what they were now. Not by blood, but by choice. And sometimes, that's stronger. Sometimes, that saves you. The rains came late that year, but they came hard like a penance the land had finally accepted. Thunder cracked across the sky like old bones breaking, and the dry wash behind Eli's ranch turned into a river overnight, swallowing fence posts and carrying off a calf too weak to stand. But inside the house, the walls held firm, and the warmth of fire and bread and familiar breath made the storm feel almost holy. Isaac had grown taller by then. His shoulders had started to square, and he carried himself like someone who knew the weight of a name, even if it wasn't the one he was born with. He rode well, better than Eli had at that age. There was quiet confidence in the way he handled a rope, a calm respect for the cattle, for the horses, for the rules of land and sky. He still played the flute some nights, just soft melodies under the hush of wind. Sometimes Cora would hum along. Sometimes Eli would sit on the porch, boots muddy, back sore, eyes closed, letting the sound fill the cracks in him that work and time had never quite healed. The town had changed, too, slowly, like old timber learning to bend without breaking. A few boys from the schoolhouse came by the ranch one weekend to help mend a broken corral. Isaac didn't say much, just handed them tools, pointed where needed, showed them how to twist wire without cutting skin. By the end of the day, they sat eating bread and honey in the shade of the barn. One of them, young Calder, the banker's nephew, asked Isaac about the flute. "Did your people teach you that?" Isaac looked at Eli, then at Cora, then at the boy. "My family did." No one questioned it. No one laughed. The next week, Mrs. Calder brought a pie. But peace is never the whole story. One morning, a letter arrived, this time not from Santa Fe, but from Fort Sumner, neatly folded, sealed with a blue wax crest. It spoke of a man, Corporal Bledsoe, claiming to be Isaac's blood uncle, said he had legal right to kin, that the boy had been taken in error. The letter stank of whiskey and guilt. Eli read it twice, then burned it in the hearth. But fire doesn't erase fear. It only masks it for a while. That night, Eli sat with Isaac on the porch. The stars were out, cold and bright as cut glass. "Someone's claiming you," he said quietly. Isaac didn't flinch. "But I already belong." Eli looked at him, at the boy he'd carried through water, fed with trembling hands, taught to ride, to build, to speak again. He felt something swell in his chest, painful and bright. "You do," Eli whispered. "You always have." Cora joined them then, sitting between the two, wrapping a blanket across their shoulders like a prayer. And the three of them watched the sky like they were waiting for an answer. The answer came the next week. Corporal Bledsoe showed up himself, tall, drunk and angry, reeking of sweat and old ambition. He stood in the yard, fists clenched, eyes wild. "He's mine," he barked. "My sister's boy. You've no right to him." Eli stepped down from the porch. "You don't own a boy like a mule," he said. "You show me you love him. Show me you bled for him. Then we'll talk." Bledsoe spat in the dirt. "You think playing house makes you a father? He's Apache, a savage." Eli's hand tightened around the reins of his horse, knuckles white. Before he could speak, Isaac stepped forward. "I have a father," he said, voice clear and low. "He's standing right there." The silence that followed was thick and final. Bledsoe didn't move, didn't argue. He just looked at the boy, at the fire in his eyes, then turned and left without another word. The dust settled behind him. Isaac never asked about him again. Later that month, Eli filed the papers. Legal guardianship. Not that it changed anything between them, but sometimes the world needed paper to understand what hearts already knew. Cora moved in the next spring, not with grand speeches or rings, just a basket of linens and a jar of plum preserves set on the kitchen table. And that was that. The garden grew. The cattle calved healthy. The barn was repaired with new beams that Isaac had measured and set himself. At night, they sat under the stars, a man, a woman, and a boy who had become theirs. And they spoke of building something more. A school, maybe. A place for other boys like Isaac. Lost things found again. And when the wind blew across the fields, it no longer sounded like grief. It sounded like a song. The wedding was small, but not silent. Cora wore a pale blue dress that had belonged to her mother, the hem let down and stitched fresh for the occasion. Eli shaved for the first time in weeks, and Isaac stood tall beside him, eyes shining with a pride he tried not to show. The ceremony took place at the edge of the pasture, beneath the cottonwood tree, where they had once buried a stillborn calf. its branches now golden in the early autumn light. There was no choir, no grand speeches, just the wind, the hush of cattle, and the words passed between them quiet, deliberate, stronger than steel. "I take you," Cora said, her voice catching, "to be the man I grow with." Eli held her hand like it was a rope that had pulled him out of some deep canyon. "And I take you, Cora, to be my beginning again." Isaac handed them 2 simple bands he had carved himself, smooth cedar rings polished with oil and care. When Eli slid Cora's onto her finger, his hands were shaking. Afterward, they shared bread and strong coffee with the handful of neighbors who had come, Mrs. Calder, the old blacksmith and his wife, even Sheriff Daniels, who offered Eli a quiet nod that said more than any blessing ever could. There were no toasts, just warm glances and soft clinking cups. At dusk, Isaac played his flute under the cottonwood. Eli watched him, his chest full, his arms wrapped around Cora, and for the first time since he'd buried his brother, he believed in tomorrow. The school came a year later, just a single room with plank floors, hand-built desks, and walls that let in more light than wind. Cora taught reading and sums. Eli taught boys how to tend a horse, mend a fence, and speak with their hands when words got stuck. Isaac taught flute on Fridays, though he never called it, that just gathered the younger ones by the creek and showed them how to make a sound mean something. They came from all over, orphaned, abandoned, or simply forgotten by the world beyond these hills. Some Apache, some Mexican, some white. It didn't matter. What mattered was they were fed, safe, and spoken to like they mattered. One boy, 7 years old, came with nothing but a pocket knife and a scar on his cheek. He refused to speak for weeks, until Isaac sat beside him one afternoon and whittled a horse. By sunset, the boy had carved one too. It wasn't about charity. Eli didn't believe in that word. It was about making something right, not with noise or vengeance, but with quiet constancy. He still rode fence lines at dawn, still mended saddles and broke colts, but the work felt different now, like it meant more than survival. One evening, a storm rolled in sharp and sudden, thunder low and rolling like the belly of a beast. Eli and Isaac worked fast to move the herd to higher ground, both soaked through before the last calf was counted. When they returned, boots caked in mud, Cora met them at the door with towels and laughter. "You two are a sight," she said, wiping Eli's forehead. Isaac leaned against the doorframe, smiling. "He slipped in the creek." Cora raised an eyebrow. "Did he now?" Eli huffed. "The rocks were slick." They ate stew that night, all 3 of them crammed near the stove, steam fogging the windows while wind rattled the roof. It should have been an ordinary night, but something in the way they sat, close, tired, full, felt like the world had shifted into place. Later, as the storm softened to rain, Eli sat beside the fire, carving. He was working on a cradle board, smooth cedar, simple design, no frills. Cora's hand slid over his. "You think it's a girl?" she asked, low. Eli looked up at her, his heart so full it hurt. "Don't matter," he whispered, "long as they come home." And when Isaac found them that night, the half-finished cradle between them, firelight dancing across their joined hands, he didn't say a word, just smiled, and sat with them as the wind swept past the eaves and the land outside drank deep from the sky. The house stood firm, full of breath and promise, and the quiet love inside it made the world feel new again.